The Soviet news agency TASS has issued a statement about the worldwide rabid anti-Soviet campaign that the United States has launched over the incident involving the South Korean plane that took off from the United States and intruded into Soviet airspace. President Reagan is setting the tone of this campaign. In his statements, he is trying to convince the public that the Soviet Union is to blame for the loss of life that occurred. But the representatives of the United States administration are evading many questions. Why was the aircraft in Soviet airspace, having departed 500 kilometers from the established international route? Why had United States and Japanese air traffic controllers, knowing this, not taken steps to stop this flagrant violation of Soviet airspace? A science commentator on the French TF1 television program has said that the Boeing 747 departed from its course specially to carry out an intelligence mission. American officials are trying to prove the plane strayed off course and lost contact. But how can one speak of a loss of contact, TASS asks, when the American authorities have themselves admitted that they tracked the flight along its entire route? A military commentator of the Japanese newspaper Mainichi says that with a computer, 2 pilots, and double and triple navigation systems on board, the departure from course appears more than strange. Numerous facts confirm, TASS says, that the Central Intelligence Agency and other American services were directly involved in this provocation. In these circumstances, it is legitimate to ask, what grounds are there for the hypocritical grief displayed by the White House? Or does the President presume that the concept of national sovereignty no longer exists and that it is possible to intrude into the airspace of independent states with impunity? Or does he now see the whole world as a zone of United States vital interests? The aim of the whole provocation is obvious, TASS concludes, and the United States administration will not succeed in casting aspersion on the Soviet Union.
Failed to take appropriate action to stop the blatant violation of the Soviet Union's sovereignty, though they knew that the aircraft was in Soviet airspace for a long period of time. Such questions are put to the American administration by journalists in the United States as well. And each time, its official has shirked an answer. But an answer is needed to find out the truth as to whom and with what purpose in mind sent the plane into Soviet airspace. As he spoke on national television, a French expert on strategic problems, General Gaulois, said that the Soviet armed forces had 2 zones that could be considered top secret. One was the area of Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula, and the other, the Sea of Okhotsk area, including the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. There, said the general, much of the Soviet Navy was concentrated, and there were installations designed for the testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles. A science commentator of the French TF1 program gives an explicit interpretation of the incident. The Boeing 747 deliberately deviated from its course for an intelligence-gathering operation. There are reports that absolutely expose the American administration's talk of some kind of technical faults in the intruder aircraft. The Japanese Kyōjutsu Sen news service quotes sources that closely followed the flight in question, saying that the South Korean liner maintained communication with the Japanese air traffic controllers almost till it disappeared. The agency reports that more than an hour after the Soviet planes had made their first attempt to establish contact with the Boeing, a telegram was sent from aboard the aircraft saying, among other things, that the navigation equipment was operating normally. It's reported in Australian papers that the flight was meticulously followed by the Central Intelligence Agency. All this confirms that this American service was directly involved in the provocation. Was it not because of the involvement of the notorious terrorist center of the United States in this entire incident that the State Department spokesman Hughes, at a press conference in Washington, repeatedly evaded the question of how the appropriate American and Japanese services had not warned the aircraft that it had violated Soviet airspace and had not withdrawn it from that space? That being so, it would be legitimate to ask, on what is based the absolutely hypocritical sorrow displayed by the White House? Is it that the president presumes that the very notion of national sovereignty exists no longer, and that it's possible to intrude into the airspace of independent nations and get away with it? Or is it that he now regards the whole world as a zone of vital United States interests? There is another side to the matter. In his speech, the President of the United States raised the question of whether it was possible to conduct negotiations with a state that was capable of such things. This statement explains many things. Clearly, the American administration is doing everything it can to frustrate the process of normalizing the world situation and to dodge the solving of international problems that touch on the vital interests of nations. It's a hypocrite's tears that the White House chief is shedding over the incident.
The Air Defense Headquarters has described the intrusion of the South Korean plane into Soviet airspace as a deliberate provocation. Colonel General Semyon Romanov told correspondents that the crew of the plane had violated international civil aviation rules. They flew without navigation lights and disregarded all efforts by a Soviet interceptor plane to make the intruder land on a Soviet airfield. Since the Boeing ignored radio signals, the Soviet pilot signaled by rolling from wing to wing and by flickering the lights. When this proved useless, he made warning shots with tracer shells along the course of the intruder plane. A measure of this kind is in keeping with the rules. Colonel General Romanov called attention to the more than strange behavior of the American and Japanese air traffic controllers serving the route. He said the plane appeared to sneak in the darkness of night over Soviet territory. There's no doubt, he said, this was a deliberate action designed as a crude provocation. The chief of the General Soviet Air Defense Headquarters said that this year alone, American military aircraft had deliberately violated the Soviet border off the Korean Islands 9 times. The Soviet news agency TASS says in a commentary that in connection with the incident involving a South Korean plane, the United States administration has staged a crude anti-Soviet campaign trying to smear the USSR and its policy. The initiators of the provocative noises are piling untruths and are hushing up the fact that responsibility for the provocation is borne by those American services that sent a plane on an intelligence mission along a route that took it 500 kilometers into Soviet territory. TASS recalls that in 1978, there was an incident in the region of Murmansk that also involved a South Korean intruder plane. That plane was made to land on Soviet territory. Are in both cases links of the same chain, namely infiltration into close areas of strategic importance? This is the North American service of Radio Moscow. Experts and the press in various countries are drawing the conclusion that the intrusion of a South Korean plane into Soviet airspace was a deliberate provocation. The British paper Guardian says that it was the Americans who could have and had to explain how the South Korean plane could deviate so greatly from course and how it could be allowed to follow that course for such a long time. It was they who could have said how a plane bound for Seoul via the Japanese islands appeared over a secret territory of Soviet Kamchatka and the Sakhalin Island. According to the Americans themselves, says the Austrian Volksstimme, their intelligence facilities taped for 2 hours all the verbal exchanges that took place in connection with the intrusion of the plane into foreign airspace. Doesn't this fact alone smack of an obvious and deliberate provocation? Weren't the Americans thereby trying to check, thus jeopardizing the lives of people, how the Soviet warning system operates? In an interview with the Italian paper Unità, one of the most experienced pilots of Alitalia Lines, Pietro Zellini, has said that such an advanced plane as the Boeing 747 couldn't lose course by mistake without noticing that it had violated the airspace of another state. If one takes the purely technical aspects of the question, it's absolutely impossible for such a type of plane to deviate from course so greatly and for such a long time. Still more strange is the fact that the plane was flying without air navigation lights and wasn't answering inquiries. Even if all 4 power supply systems went out of order, there is still an emergency power reserve. And for that reason, only one thing seems possible. The deviation from course had been prearranged before the flight took place. So one could only speak of a cold-blooded calculation by those interested in that so-called error. The British paper Daily Star says that the giant Boeings have long been used by the United States as spy planes, the kind of Boeings that the South Koreans have lost. Planes that have no markings and are full of advanced electronic equipment. And the Russians, the paper adds, undoubtedly know this. The Portuguese newspaper Diário says the United States was in the know of the developments involving the South Korean plane from the very beginning. Thus, it's a premeditated act of provocation. The United States itself created the incident, and now it intends to turn it into an international problem with far-reaching consequences to continue to sabotage the Geneva talks and prevent the return to the policy of easing international tension in the near future. The New York Times states that President Reagan hopes that the case of the airliner will strengthen his position on issues of the military budget and the United States policy in Central America, and that in the diplomatic sphere, it will help him to win support for Washington's plans involving the deployment of new American missiles in Europe. A prominent West German political figure, the chairman of the provincial branch of the German Social Democratic Party in Saarland, Chief Burgomaster of Saarbrücken, Oscar Lafontaine, has said that certain circles are using the case of the airliner to justify their own policy of the arms race. No matter how horrible it may sound, but these circles are prepared to use the loss of human lives to justify their arms race philosophy. A number of publications remind the reader that in 1978, in the area of Murmansk in the Kola Peninsula, there was an incident with another South Korean plane that had violated Soviet airspace and was landed by Soviet aircraft on Soviet territory. Recalling this fact, the French press asks, could these be links of a single chain, penetration into zones on Soviet territory, which are closed areas of strategic importance? You've been listening to a review of press comment on the incident involving the South Korean airliner. This is the North American service of Radio Moscow.